What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson here with Matt Duss. How you doing, man?
Doing all right. Great to see you.
And Julia's got the day off. Well earned. And you just got back from China. We're throwing out the script for this episode, I should say, and we're just going to, there's a lot of stuff to talk about. So we're just going to talk about it and see what happens.
Unlike the usual well-rehearsed, line readings. Got back early Monday morning, just starting to get readjusted slowly to the time difference. As I was just telling Van before we started, I slept 11 hours last night. I'm feeling much better. But yeah, I was there last week for the the Beijing Zhengshan Forum, which is, I think, China's kind of premier national security conference. Really interesting.
Multilateral, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Multilateral. Spoke on a panel on U.S.-China relations. I mean, one thing I'll note is that, all the sessions on U.S.-China relations were extremely well attended. I mean, some of the other ones I stepped into had varying levels of attendance, but of I think the four, including mine, that focused on U.S.-China, there was kind of standing room only, which I think says a lot. There, as here, there is a great deal of interest in the relationship between the United States and China. Also, unsurprisingly, a very big representation from global South countries, certainly Asia, East Asia. But really, good experience. I'd never been to Beijing before. So there was that. Glad to do that. But yeah. And also, I'll just mention that my opening remarks for the session, the panel I spoke at are, you can find them on CIP's website. We just published them yesterday.
Yeah. Have a read. We'll try to stick it in the show notes too. It's a good set of remarks. It's very much where our collective heads are at on China right now. So that's good. Where did the U.S. government send reps this time?
They did. They sent a delegation. Apparently, it was the biggest one yet, which I think is good. A DoD-led representation. They kept a kind of relatively low profile. I don't think they spoke on any panels, but they were there. But yeah, it was. So yeah, I didn't really engage with them too much. I saw them around, traveling in their pack from here to there. Obviously good to be there and be part of that and represent. But it was interesting, as like I said, the U.S.-China sessions were very well attended, but there was not a lot of kind of U.S. bashing or like open U.S. criticism from the speaker, certainly in the plenaries. But there was, interestingly, just kind of a sense of kind of, I don't know how I put this, like China's here to help make peace, whereas the U.S.-led order leads to what we're seeing in the Middle East and what we're seeing in Europe right now. Of course, despite the fact that China is helping one side, the aggressive side, the aggressor side in the Ukraine war. But yeah, and that is one of my big takeaways was, China is very much leaning into the peacemaking space, stability and peace as kind of a goal of the international system. And sure, that's rhetorical, but rhetoric matters. Of course, you can point out some of the hypocrisies in that, and that's valid. Every country's foreign policy has its hypocrisies. But the reason I bring it up is just because the United States largely seems to have abandoned that rhetorical space as a goal.
They talk about the world the way that we should talk about the world.
Right.
And I find a lot of it hollow, and it's not a reliable indicator of what China does at any given point. But shouldn't we want aspirational framing?
Absolutely, we should. I mean, not just because it's a good thing to want, but also, I mean, other countries in the world want that.
Yeah.
I mean, that is something that is going to appeal to a lot of the countries and publics that we absolutely need to be working with. And let's also mean it and try and do it, but just like kind of lifting it up as a real legitimate end goal of our foreign policy and a global order that we want to help strengthen and create, I think is something we need to get back into the business of.
Yeah. And I see the US, policymakers especially, have this tendency to exempt ourselves when we see bad things in the world or dark trends emerging. And of course we are implicated in these things causally, analytically, and morally, but like they exclude America from this kind of analysis, but the rest of the world doesn't. The rest of the world doesn't have like American exceptionalist blinders on. And so like we're gonna be sort of at odds with how everyone else sees things, and we're gonna be unpleasantly surprised by how others sort of make choices and navigate the world if we're operating from the wrong script, and like in the unipolar moment we had a margin of error for getting away with that kind of like live in our own bubble, but like that's not the world. I mean, one reality of multipolarity is like we can't afford to like just be aloof of like our role in things,
Yes. Right. The various like hypocrisies and kind of double talk that works, in the North Atlantic has far less appeal elsewhere in the world, which is to say the vast majority of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Right before you left for the trip, Financial Times had a piece that was like insider reporting about the US back channel with Jake Sullivan and like Wang Yi, the foreign minister.
Yes.
And it was interesting, the piece going like taking the insider's point of view. There wasn't like a ton of new information in the piece, but it made a big splash, and it almost seemed like it was trying to nudge the Harris campaign, or like a would-be Harris presidency, in the direction of like keeping the back channel going. Like we've got this thing. It's better than not having it, and so we ought to, whatever we do on China, we ought to at least keep this thing in place. But one of the interesting things that came out of it was like this exchange between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi, where Jake was trying to convince the Chinese delegation that like, look, we are in a competitive relationship with you. Like there's a degree of like antagonism and zero sumness to how we coexist with you, but we would like to coexist. And that means cooperate on some things. And that's like the standard Washington line. It's like cooperate where we have an interest, but compete everywhere else kind of thing. And I think I think policymakers see that as like an innocent thing, or like, hey, that's just how we're operating. But Wang Yi in the piece said like he flatly rejected that framing of the relationship. If we're competitive purely, right? And like this is, it's interesting, that they're not accepting that argument. They're saying that you cannot have cooperation and dialogue and communication, and at the same time, in their words, you cannot at the same time undercut China's interests, which is like logical, right? So the valence of the relationship, like that determines what kinds of policies you can do. And so if it's going to be competitive, we foreclose on the ability to cooperate on things that we need to cooperate on. Did you get any of this competitive cooperative?
Yeah, I definitely did. That was another takeaway. I mean, that is kind of the line. They want to force a choice. And, I get it. I want to try and see things from their perspective, but I also don't quite buy it, because it's like, listen, if we want a mature, multifaceted relationship, there are going to be elements of competition. There are going to be elements of cooperation and collaboration, hopefully. I hope very much more of the latter than the former. But, I think all of these things are part of mature diplomatic relations. Now, I absolutely agree. We should not see, and I wrote this, I've written it before, I said it in my remarks, a zero-sum approach to the relationship is going to be bad for everyone. It will not achieve security or prosperity for anyone. It will lead inevitably to conflict. But I also think it's wrong to insist that it needs to be just one thing. U.S. companies compete with even, European companies. Our companies compete with, countries, companies from our closest allies. Now, I guess that's different from, okay, are we a competitor state with your state?
So there's a rhetorical issue here. If the relationship is zero sum, then it forecloses on the ability to cooperate where we have shared interests. If it is natural in international relations that there are competitions that arise.
Yes.
But is that the valence of the relationship or not? That's the question.
Right. And I guess what I'm saying is like there can be elements of competition that do not therefore define the entire relationship as zero sum.
That I accept that. Yeah. That's cool. Okay. Well, glad you're back.
Yeah, thank you.
The other thing we need to talk about, I mean, I'm talking about whatever, I don't know, but as we're sort of recording this, we just got news yesterday about the Hezbollah beeper explosion fucking nightmare. So the news is trickling out fast and updating fast, but it looks like 3,100 casualties so far, a couple dozen actually dead, including women and children. This is an Israeli state conducted terrorist attack, not even state sponsored.
Not admitted, but everyone safely assumes that this is what happened.
There was a winking emoji on Twitter from an Israeli official about it, which says kind of so this is like hugely problematic for people who don't know. I'm sure everybody's heard about this by now, but basically there's pagers that Hezbollah uses to stay off the phone grid, to communicate. Those pagers ultimately came from a Taiwanese company that licensed the production in Hungary, where we've got basically a far-right autocrat in charge, and the company produced these pagers, but Israel had infiltrated the supply chain there, stuck plastic or some shit in it that allowed it to detonate when a message got entered, and so they blew the shit up. I read, who knows what's true. One thing I read that was interesting was that Israel did not do this necessarily for like a strategic purpose, but they did this because they got found out and Hezbollah was about to switch up their trade craft. And so Israel took this like use or lose attitude toward it. And they're like, well, of course we're going to use it. And so it didn't serve some grander design of any kind. There wasn't like a bet involved necessarily. It was like, we're going to just kill our enemies, even if there's fallout, you know?
Right. I mean, that's my understanding too, right now, at least, is that this is something they put in place, for like, as they were about to, escalate, just trigger this to knock out, a communications method that Hezbollah had in advance of the larger, attack or whatever. And they had gotten wind that that Hezbollah was going to be switching their process or something that would make this, less valuable. And so they just triggered it. But you also have the fact that, the United States has been pretty heavily engaged in trying to de-escalate between Israel and Hezbollah. And as Israel has shown repeatedly, they don't really care about that. They're just going to go ahead and do things that undermine the painstaking diplomatic efforts of the United States whenever they feel like it. So, in terms of the actual legal issues here, I would point folks to a great piece in Just Security by Brian Finucane, who's an analyst for the International Crisis Group dealing with the law of war issues, which is worth reading. But it's also, I mean, my own comment was, you see everyone out there praising. I responded to a tweet by David French calling this a precisely targeted, act. And, my response was like triggering us, hundreds of bombs, though they may be small, without knowing how many or who or which civilians are in close proximity at that time is not precise. That's not a word that you can use to describe this. And as we've seen, thousands of casualties. And of course, Israel is claiming that, they're all Hezbollah terrorists. Well, this I think it was a 9-year-old girl who was killed,
not
carrying her pager to her father. And all these others, nurses and others. And of course, the response is, well, they're nurses at a Hezbollah hospital. You do run into, some of these questions of like, well, when you have an organization that you've designated as a terrorist, like Hezbollah and like Hamas, that essentially serve state functions, you're going to classify the guy who runs the DMV as a terrorist and therefore, a legitimate target. It's it's a huge problem.
I mean, first of all, this is as precise as 9/11 was, right? That's if you're going to call it precise, that's the same standard. Like, you're killing a bunch of civilians on your way to a strategic target. That's not right. But also, Israel, this is mass murder, and it's based on identity categories. What would you call that? Based on, we've designated them a certain kind of person. and because they're a certain kind of person, they happen to be in
Yeah,
physical proximity
right.
to strategic targets.
Only a certain kind of person would have these devices, and therefore, yes.
That's beyond slippery slope,
Right.
man. Like that's we're in
And if kids die, well, the problem is they just shouldn't have chosen to be born to one of these designated people. That's essentially the logic.
the idea of state murder on the basis of identity categories is like
Yeah.
the new nightmare.
Yeah.
And it's a nightmare that, like, ironically, Israel of all nations should be reflexively, categorically opposed to,
Yes.
So this is fucking sickening. But
Yeah.
also, like, it is in Israel's mind, are they not already in a regional war? Like, they're acting like it. They're acting like the Gaza
Yeah.
war has no bounds,
Right. No, I mean, you could argue. I mean, we've been in kind of this state for months and months, if not years. But we're in a particularly dangerous situation right now, where you have Israel led by a prime minister whose only hope of political survival is to sustain and prolong and escalate this conflict
Expand, yeah.
for as long as possible. That's the only way he comes out of this, retaining a shred of power or a political career. And that, I think, that is still true, and that's been true. That's been very, very clear from the very beginning. And yet, the Biden administration, which is the only, this United States is the only country that can impose the sort of costs on Netanyahu that might change his behavior, has simply refused to do that.
I mean, I cannot even utter the words that the Biden administration's working day and night, the US government's working day and night. Physically, they are, but it doesn't
Yeah.
matter. You're doing it all for nothing if you don't use the leverage that you
Yeah.
have to cause the outcome that you need. And in the meantime,
That's right.
horizontal escalation
Yeah.
is what we're witnessing in real time.
Yeah.
Horizontal escalation, in addition to
Yeah,
the
no,
escalation in Gaza.
it's true, that Amos Hochstein and Brett McGurk and Tony Blinken are spending lots of times in planes and in meeting rooms, and I am sure that is tiring. But the bottom line is, President Biden still refuses to use the enormous leverage that the United States has to actually change decision making, or to impose any cost, or to change the kind of incentive structure here.
We can see it. Like, we know, everybody knows that, like, there's a point of leverage that we could try to use that would
Yeah.
matter and that would put us on the right side of this
Right.
issue. And
And
instead
are
we don't.
legally, in fact, and legally required to
Yeah.
use if we followed the law.
Yes. The double standard on the law here is really egregious. And it's the same for this. Like, think about the last 30 years, how much we have altered global economic order and the global political order
Yeah.
in the pursuit of sanctions against state-sponsored terrorism, not even
Mhm. Yeah.
state-conducted terrorism, just state-sponsored.
Right.
And now we're actively supporting a state-conducted terrorist operation,
Mhm.
and like we're so tied into Israeli intelligence, like country to country. Like, who knows? I'm not saying like we were involved in this in any way, but like we're involved at a system level
Yes.
with the systems that conducted this shit. And so,
Right, and we've also been the key outside player that's actually created the environment, the permissive environment,
that's right.
I would
Yeah.
argue, that led to this in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the reason why, and again, I'm not going to blame, Hamas has culpability and responsibility for launching that attack, but the environment that took place in, an environment of complete hopelessness, no horizon for liberation, only nothing but years of continued occupation and repression and settlement in front of you. That environment was created by US-backed impunity.
Yeah. We need to do a lot more to think about. I mean, this is what I guess we do with CIP to some extent, like thinking about how we create structures and environments that are not neutral. Like, everybody has to own their own decisions, right? Everybody
Mhm.
deserves blame for when they pull the trigger,
Mhm. Right.
but you can create situations that make it more likely that the trigger gets pulled, more
Yes.
likely that escalation occurs. And like,
Right.
we don't seem to think that way about policy. And like, that's what we need.
Right.
We really need that.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've tended to put it, I mean, I've said this for a while, it's like, instead of a policy that, affirms and supports the arguments of the worst people, which is what we've had, let's have a policy that affirms and supports the best people. It's just a crazy concept that I think makes sense.
Yeah, going back to the whole like ambitious rhetoric that China deploys,
Yeah.
like let's talk about peace, and
Yeah.
then that can let political actors hold other political actors to account to live up to the
Right.
rhetoric. I mean,
Right.
like that's a terrain that would be much more favorable.
Right.
Anyways, okay, well, cool, not cool. I don't know. Tragic, fucking.
Very, very not cool.
Yeah, very not cool. Let's be on the record about that.
Yes, absolutely.
So there was one story also in the Financial Times, weirdly, Pakistan and the intersection with China, the sovereign debt crisis, and the green transition. So there's this piece, kind of a nonsensical headline called "Chinese Solar Panel Boom Threatens Pakistan's Debt-Ridden Grid," and there's so many. There's like it's like a case study that's happening in real time, where it's like the particular says everything about the universal kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
those are the best.
Yeah, yeah. And multinational firms in Pakistan, like Coca-Cola, Adidas, Hyundai, they're pushing Pakistani factories to reduce their carbon footprint, but not to improve labor conditions or increase wages, obviously. And so you see evidence of basically capital greenwashing, ongoing worker precariousness. But also, that's not even like the main story. Like Pakistani companies want to go to solar. They want to transition to green energy because electricity from their traditional energy grid is like insanely expensive. So Pakistan is now one of the largest, I think the third largest importer of Chinese solar panels, which are obviously super cheap. And they want those solar panels because it reduces the cost of energy. That's what we want. That sounds like a good thing, and on its face, it actually is. But in context, there's a wrinkle here, which is like the process of companies going green in Pakistan is massively inflating the price of traditional energy from their grid. And workers can't afford solar panels, but they also have no choice but to rely on grid energy, and they can't afford that because the price of grid energy is spiking because companies are switching to solar. And so as demand drops, ironically, the price actually goes up. And so this gets even more complicated because about a decade ago, Pakistan, I mean, they've always had like chronic power outages, energy shortages, and they borrowed billions of dollars from multilateral lenders and from China, especially, to finance the traditional energy grid so that they wouldn't have these chronic outages and shit. Well, the sovereign debt that they accumulated to finance their energy grid is weighing down the economy. Pakistan is effectively debt distressed, and they had to take a bailout from the IMF, I think last year or the year before, and they cannot afford, and because of the IMF loan, are not allowed basically to subsidize their energy, to cut costs for energy for their own people. And so the moral of the story for the Pakistan case is that climate, the sovereign debt crisis, and like geopolitical posturing around China, it's all connected. They are all three problems that can only be resolved together or not at all. And if you try to resolve them piecemeal and not as a whole, then you end up just redirecting the pain from one area to another area, or redirecting the pain from one set of constituencies to another set of constituencies. I don't know. It's like, this is fascinating and problematic and reinforces the idea that like we have to tackle all this stuff. It can't just be one.
Right.
It's I'd not read a piece like this in a while. Yeah. What else we got? Anything else?
Oh man, what a question.
There's I saw Israel's deploying paratroopers near Lebanon, which is ominous. I don't know what's going to happen, but it doesn't look
I
good.
mean, that's been like, going back to that, I mean, it's been kind of on the brink for a while. Again, that's what the administration's been trying to avert. And then, I mean, I criticize them a lot because they deserve it in the Middle East, but averting a war up until now, and even worse, escalation, has not been an accident. I mean, there has been some important diplomatic work done to kind of, calm things down when they seem, closer to coming to a boil. But it all just comes down to the fact that they will not do what I think they should do to actually end the source of the conflict, which is Gaza. So
Yeah.
they are just, nibbling around the edges of this. But it also gets to what, you were saying. In a way, it's also an example of, you will not deal with this piecemeal. We're going to keep, as we have every few years, we come back to a conflict in Gaza. This one obviously is far worse than anything we've seen before. I mean, but we go back 2021, 2014, 2018. Just every few years you have one of these wars, because you refuse to really take a run at trying to address the larger problem in using the tools that you have. So again, I mean, if we want to switch, this is, a lot of us, including me, are waiting to see signs that a Biden a Harris administration will deal with this in a meaningfully different way. And they're clearly being very, very careful. They've made a calculation that there's not much, if anything, to gain about signaling any daylight from Biden's policy, which I think is disappointing, because I mean, this policy is without question a catastrophic failure.
It might be an electoral albatross too. Like that's
again, yes. Again, as I've said, I don't want to argue that foreign policy really is going to turn the election, but this, this could impact it at the margins, and this will be a close election that will be won or lost on the margins.
Yeah.
And you could also make a decision that's also politically good and also morally good. Strategically, morally, and politically correct. I mean,
fancy
checks a number of boxes. But
yeah, I mean, so like, I have no great love for the Biden administration's policies, almost across the board on foreign policy. Like, there are a couple exceptions, but like, I do, and Harris, as extremely disappointed as I am in what she's said so far about foreign policy, like, I kind of recognize, like you suggested, how can she really make a break from the Biden administration while she's part of it? Like that. I think she sees it largely as an area where she can only lose. And like, the more she says, the more she's just taking risks, but right, like, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, so like despite all of that, I do kind of think, like, if there was MAGA presidency as a counterfactual, and in a few months there could be, the horizontal escalation of Israel, like spanning war across the region, I have to think like a Trump administration would not be as interested and invested in checking the horizontal escalation as the Biden administration has. Like, they're not using the leverage they need. There is a root cause problem here that they're not looking at or willing to address, but like, they're invested heavily in the crisis management aspect of trying to like prevent the Middle East from just absolutely exploding. And I don't know that the Trump administration would be as invested in that prevention project.
Well, it's interesting because, I think Trump tended to do things that brought us to the brink several times, as you and I have both written. But there were also moments when, looking down the barrel of a massive escalation, which he was doing several times, like, he pulled back.
Yeah, he backed down.
He loves the rhetoric. He loves to posture as a strong man. He loves to talk trash to everyone. But I think when so again, I'm not going to pretend he's a peacenik. He does things that bring us to these situations, extremely dangerous, extremely reckless, and extremely unpredictable. But, so again, I'm not going to pretend that he would handle this better. He certainly wouldn't. He would handle it far, far worse. He would, because I think there were, we basically got lucky a number of times with Trump, that others behaved more rationally than the president of the United States, and these things didn't get out of control.
That's right. Yeah, I spoke at the Fabian Society the other night, and that was one of the things I think I put it in Q&A or remark. At some point, I said basically that, like, Trump is not the guy who pulls the trigger. He's the guy who sets up the situation so that pulling the trigger is all but inevitable.
Right.
Right. And so, Yeah, we're not gonna see him
Yeah.
take the big risks directly. He's just gonna take risks on all our behalf and
Right.
then, like, leave it to somebody else or to
Yeah.
fate or something.
Right. He's
Yeah.
not the guy who throws the first punch. He's just the guy who starts talking trash in the bar.
Creates the
Right.
confrontation, yeah.
Exactly.
That's a good metaphor. All right, well, as usual, I feel, warm and fuzzy, so
Yeah, no, we you know, I know we kind of wing this one, but we do need to kind of have a standing feel good segment, you know.
yeah.
Can you just find some clips of like puppies or dolphins or something just
We'll
to play at
we'll
the end
edit
here?
something in,
All right,
yeah.
please put those in.
All right, folks. Well, that was fun. That's gonna do it. We'll
All
get
right.
you back next week
All
and,
right.
more news.
Hey, before we go out, I want to say one last thing. Sorry about that. I know you said the farewell name, but I just want to give a shout out to Derek Grossman from Rand, who came up to me, introduced himself at the conference in Beijing as a podcast listener. So got to spend a little time with him. He said he listens to it on his commute out in California. So, hey, Derek, hope you're doing well. Thanks a lot.
All right, look, there we go. You can meet us in real life sometimes. All right. All right, take care. All right, peace.